Haydn, Salieri, right? So, a lot of really good composers. But as we go on and on and on, right, in the classical period, right, slowly people start pushing those boundaries a little bit, because sometimes people want a little bit of dissonance, right? People want a little bit of kind of like unpleasantness and resolution. And it's more than that. It's as time goes on, right? People start to break these rules. And by people, I mean one person. And we'll get into that, right? And then that's how we end up at the Romantic period. So, like, the kind of, like, driving, like, mentality or forces behind this is the cultural change. Again, so there's the whole Age of Enlightenment movement, right? But then people start to kind of push back against that. And, like, the scientific explanation for everything. So people are, like, kind of, they don't like that as much. It's not as, like, popular, right? So instead, people start, like, drawing their inspiration from music from things that are more abstract, you know, more supernatural, more from nature, or from nationalism, or their personal experiences. Like, music that is biographical, right, became more common at this time. So people, like, those motivations are there, but also, like, mechanical improvement is, like, very, very critical during this time. It's part of the reason that we end up with the music that we have, because if you look at, like, an old piano, right, like a piano from the 1700s, right, you can see them in museums sometimes, the kind of piano that Mozart would have played, right, that Haydn would have played, that, you know, they're much smaller than this, and they're much frailer than this. You'll see them, they're smaller, they look weaker, almost, right, and then, like, pianos almost became, like beasts during this time. You know, they're bigger, they're stronger, they're made of better stuff, they're more powerful, right? You can, like, bang away at them, and you know that, like, nothing's gonna happen. You can be as loud, like, your capacity for volume is huge all of a sudden, right? So those kinds of mechanical improvements were huge driving forces. Like, some of these things, right, you can't play them technically, like Romantic music. Like, your piano would fall apart if you tried to play it on a piano from 1700, right? And then the other thing that was really, really a driving force behind the Romantic period, right, was the rise of the middle class in Europe. Because music used to be mainly for the nobility, by the nobility, right? So the nobility commissions it, you play it, other rich people listen to it, it's made for a small audience, right, a small, very niche, targeted audience. But now, with the rise of the middle class, right, to make your name, right, to become, like, well-known, to get, like, that artist in residence, to make a good career, composers compose for the general public to be famous, right, at public festivals, at public concerts, right, and a lot of this, like, general public doesn't have music background, like, they don't care, right, about your perfect counterpoint, about the perfect harmony, they don't listen to music every day like that. Instead, people want music that can connect with them, right, music that is passionate, like, music that is very free, right, and freedom is, like, the underlying, like, component of the Romantic period, right? And it's music that is much, much more open, right? And it's not like Bach, right? Or Bach or Telemann or Vivaldi. They don't express emotion in their music. Of course there's emotion in their music. Of course there are elements of their life in their music, right? But those things are more subtle, right? They're hidden behind form, they're hidden behind counterpoint, they're hidden behind structure. You can still hear them, but in comparison to that, Romantic music is kind of like wearing your heart on your sleeve sometimes, you know? It's being very open and very clear sometimes, like, it's very, like, passionate is what I used earlier, it's a great word. And really, the transition into the Romantic period, we can attribute that to one person, and that's Beethoven. So you might not have seen Beethoven earlier, right, on my list of classical period composers. And that's because Beethoven is neither classical nor Romantic. So, like I talked about earlier, right, we end up in a new period of music because, like, cultural values changed, and because of those cultural values, composers started changing what they did, and then more composers copied them, and then more composers copied them until music was completely different, right? So, Beethoven is the main driving force between this classical to Romantic shift, right? So, Beethoven, so we're going to examine this kind of through sonata form, right? So, both of what I played you earlier was I played you two Mozart sonata snippets, right? So this both Mozart sonatas. That is very much what the classical sonata is, right? And let me make sure. I'm looking for the year. So, like, that first one was 1788, right? And the next one was 1784, right? So this was 1784, and I just played it an octave too high. And the other one was 1788. And in comparison, the sonata I'm about to play you is Beethoven's Pathetique, okay? So that was in 1798. So about 10 years after this, right? Because it's not like Beethoven and Mozart were one after the other. Like, they were contemporaries, right? Like, they existed at the same time. There was some overlap. They did many of the same things, right? So, Beethoven, right, wrote 32 sonatas throughout his life, and you can kind of split these into, like, 3 periods, right? Like, your early and your middle and your late sonatas. And, like, Beethoven's sonatas are some of, like, the most, like, quintessential, right? The most, like, important, like, works of classical music, like, fundamental to the classical music repertoire that any pianist plays in their life, right? Many of Beethoven's sonatas, like, you have to play at least a few, right? Like, you just have to as a pianist. It's because they're, like, I couldn't say I know many advanced pianists who haven't, right? So, you can see how Beethoven's early piano sonatas, right, are, like, based on the ideas of Mozart and based on the ideas of Haydn, right? Like, those are our quintessential classical sonata composers, but from the very, very beginning, right, Beethoven is kind of exploring, and Beethoven is pushing the limits, right, of how much freedom you're allowed to have. Because there really isn't a huge difference between 1788 and 1798. It's only 10 years, right? But within the span of 10 years, Beethoven is doing something completely different. And when I play you this, right, don't think that it's normal, because this is very, very abnormal for the time. Pathetique is one of the most revolutionary, like, sonatas of its time and just of classical music in general. And of all of Beethoven's early sonatas, the 12 or 13 or so that there are, right, it's the most important one, because this is the most, like, romantic in nature. Some of the other sonatas will very much follow, right, like the Mozart textbook, right? But this was different. This was Beethoven's, like, first venture, right, into what happens when I break these rules and what happens when we have discord in our music. So I'm going to play you a few chords before I start to explain what I mean. And at the very beginning of Pathetique, Beethoven has this intro, right? And this introduction is it's like a slow introduction to what is otherwise a very fast sonata, right? It's a grave, right? So it's a dark and it's angry and it's very, very expressive for classical music. Look what happens, right? When Mozart feels like longing, right? When Mozart feels longing, it sounds like this, right? Like what we heard earlier. That's how Mozart feels longing, right? And that longing is answered very quickly. But what happens when Beethoven feels anger, when Beethoven feels longing, when he feels upset, right? Because that was Mozart feeling upset. This is Beethoven feeling upset. And what we hear, too, for the first time is, not the first time necessarily, but what we hear here that is very important is things that sound dissonant for the first time. So let me talk about dissonance in general. Is you have chords that sound pretty, right? I said it earlier. So here you have, right, you have, those are all things that sound pretty together. But you also have, like, this, right? I wouldn't necessarily call it, like, the prettiest. Like, it's doable, right? But so what you'll see here is in each of these opening chords, Beethoven will create something that's, like, not pretty, and then he'll resolve it, is one of the most important ideas. So I'm going to stop talking now. I'm going to play you just the very introduction of Beethoven's Pathetique. This is Opus 13, right? Alright. And I think you'll be able to hear the difference very clearly. And then it'll go on from there and become something completely different, right? But like, look at that. Like, look at the depth of emotion there. Look at the contrast we have there, right? Something I talked about earlier in the Baroque period. Look at things like slowly getting louder and slowly getting softer, right? And so the Mozarts I played earlier weren't great examples of that. They just tended to be more segmented just by nature, right? But look at like how we gradually grow, right? For example, you have this, right? Right, so this starts soft. Softer, louder, louder. Right? So the way we grow, right? But just like look at almost like how much like power you have there, right? And how just I don't know. I think just hearing it feels very different, right? But from a time period perspective, right? This was still like very similar. This was still like a time period that Mozart operated in, right? This coexisted without music. Can you imagine in public performance hearing this? And the next thing you hear, right, is so really, like, this is when Beethoven started to push the limits. But don't think that he, like, pushed them, like, so much. Like, don't think that, like, in 10 years, right, Beethoven created something completely different. What you have to understand is this is completely out of the norm, right? But here's, like, another section of the same pathetique, right? Right? And doesn't that remind you a little bit of our Mozart? Think about it. We have our accompaniment, right? We have... But then you have our melody. Doesn't it sound familiar? Right? Sorry, that was... But, right, there's still elements, right, of that. We have our accompaniment, we have our melody, right? Our melody is pretty straightforward, right? Right? It's pretty simple, right? So Beethoven was still very much a classical musician. He was just pushing the boundaries of what a classical musician could be and what rules a classical musician had to follow, right? So another catalyst, really, for the entire Romantic period is it is very, very famous that, or very well known, right, that Beethoven was deaf, right? So, as one of the most famous pieces, right, that he writes. So when he finds out that he's going deaf and he'll lose his hearing, he writes this letter. I can't remember, it has an official name, but I can't remember what it is. He writes a letter to one of like his friends, who's like an archduke or a bishop or something, and it's this entire outpouring, right, of like what will I do, like what will happen with my life, right, and like partially like suicidal thoughts. But after that too, he says, I'm determined to take a different direction. And one of the transitions between early Beethoven and middle period Beethoven, which is very romantic, right? Late period Beethoven, I'm not going to play for you today. It's like 5 sonatas. They're considered some of the most like emotionally advanced pieces in classical music repertoire. You usually don't play them until you're older. I've never tackled any of them, right? But the transition to early classical Mozart to middle period romantic Mozart, right? Like Sonata and Quasi-Fantasia, right? Like a sonata that's like a fantasy, like the Moonlight Sonata is one of the most famous transition periods. And I'm so sorry, I see that there also. I have talked too much, bad habit, and it's almost 10 o'clock as well. So maybe I will wrap up with this romantic period in the next like 5-10 minutes if you guys have the time, and then we can touch on contemporary music another time, right? But again, if anyone needs to leave or if anyone has questions before they go, please just unmute yourself and interrupt me. I can't really see the Discord screen when I'm looking at the presentation, and I didn't know. I was worried about being under, actually, not being over. Right. So back to what I was saying though, is the Moonlight Sonata, right? Which I'm sure everybody has heard maybe parts of, or you'll probably recognize it when you hear it, right? But one of the most famous Beethoven sonatas, and also one of the most famous, not just like one of the most well-known, but also in terms of like style and musical history, one of the most significant, right? And what was also significant about this is the first, so traditionally, right, like a sonata has a fast movement and a slow movement in the middle, and then like another fast movement at the end. And this was Beethoven's very first like slow opening to a sonata, right? A sonata usually doesn't open with this. Like if you have a sad movement, right? Something slow, something darker, something heavier. It's shorter and it's in the middle, right? That's your second movement of like the three. So sonatas are always three movements. Sorry, I forgot to say that, right? But the second one is always supposed to be that. This is much more characteristic of what a second movement would be, right? So that was very, very out of character. But let me just play you part of this, and you'll see what I mean, because this kind of change, it's freer form, right? And more nice. Our melody is not as clear. It's not like a clear melody with an accompaniment. Even Pathétique, right, was a clear melody with an accompaniment. Like the main line of Pathétique is right. There's some like fancier left hand going on. Sorry, I don't have the notes pulled up. But that was the main idea of Pathétique. There's still a clear melody, which for all the beauty of the Moonlight Sonata, is a little bit harder to hear the melody here, right? So I'll just play you the beginning, maybe page or two of this. Probably a bit much there, and this key kicks in and out sometimes, so you might have heard some unexpected gaps there, right? But this was really, really a lot of transition. Like, if you break this down too, which I'm not going to do now, don't worry, but by form, right, and by like structure, it's very, very different from your traditional sonata form. And this is how Beethoven kept pushing and pushing and pushing, and he became so popular, right, that other composers that wanted their music to sell, that wanted their music to be well-liked, that wanted their music to be, like profitable as well, kind of followed that trend, right? And that is what really, really ushered in, like, the Romantic era of music. And, sorry, 10:05. So I will try to wrap up by 10:10, if that's okay with everyone. So, okay, I'm not going to play both these, but then, again, the middle is really just like a development on this. So I'll play, like, the very, very beginning of Beethoven's Tempest, which is, like, firmly in the territory of a romantic sonata, right? So, I'll put the main lines of this. So this starts like very similar to the Pathetique, right? Not a drum, it's a largo this time, but look at the tempo shift here. Right, and that goes on and on. You have something similar like that. So then you end up with this. I'm just going to skip a little bit. And then the third movement of this is very much like... Right? And think about that compared to this. Right? So we've ended up somewhere that is very, very different. And that is, in huge part, thanks to Beethoven. And just very quickly going through them, right, look, the key ideas of this Romantic period, again, were like less strictness, like all those rules, right, on sonata form, on symphony, on trio, say I'm writing a trio, say I'm writing a quartet, concerto form, right, all those forms became looser, right, like the rules were less strict. People aren't going to not listen to your sonata because it doesn't follow the rules, right? People aren't going to listen to your sonata and say, oh, well, his development section was wrong, or oh, he didn't do a key change here, right? People don't care. Again, because a lot of our audience were, like, the general public, right? The lyrical melodies and themes, right? But music here just became, like, free, like, more, like, just, you can do what you want. And the idea of, like, dissonance and the unexpected, like, the less traditional, all became really, really popular here, right? And some really, really famous composers from this time are Chopin, Liszt, Rachmaninoff, Brahms, Tchaikovsky, etc., etc. The list goes on, right? And I'm completely biased. Romantic period music is my favorite to play. But let me just play you one or two different examples, and we will wrap up for today. And there's not a lot here that, like, structurally I'm trying to point out, or, like, thematically, like, like from a technical, like, theory standpoint, I'm trying to point out. The shift from classical to romantic had a lot less to do with theory and had a lot more to do with, like, emotion, right? So, let me play you, do I have it here? Okay, one moment. Okay. Let me play you part of one of my favorite pieces, which is Chopin's Ballade No. 1. Right?
How
much time? I'll play like super quick second. Okay, so this is starting in the middle, of course, but... getting there is a little bit messy, right? But just like the kind of musical freedom we have here, right? For this to come as, for that to become, right? And I was going to play Rachmaninoff, but I'll wrap up instead. So there are a couple of other things here too, but you can kind of read about it. I'll post it in the main discussion as well. But then there's also some further reading here for anybody who's interested, right? But that was very much the Romantic period. So here's another very, very, very short example, I promise, right? But okay, is there? What are you? Just so you see, this is an example of somewhat nationalistic music, because it's a bit of Rachmaninoff. But that really ends up here, so this is where you end with, there's a whole section like that, and you end here, right? Where's the good place? Alright. Okay, yeah. A great example, but if you listen to more romantic music as well, you'll just kind of, you'll feel it, right? That kind of everything that I feel is going to be put out there into the world as clearly as I can put it out there. And, I don't care if it is sad, if it is happy, if it is moody, right? It's just going to be there. And I'm not really going to follow the rules that exist. And in very, very brief summary, right? Eventually people began pushing that more and more and more in different directions, right? Because the Romantic period was about saying, playing what you feel, writing what you feel as a composer, and that went in all of these different directions, right? For the next 30 or so years, and after the 1930s or 40s, classical music was no longer the pop music. It kind of faded to, jazz and music of the 60s, 70s, 80s came up, and it became kind of less prevalent. So, yeah, so you can also read about that, I guess, in the slides if that's something that interests you. But other than that, sorry for going so far over time today. Thanks for listening, guys. Not sure I had too much to say, but it was fun to have a reason, to get everything ready and think about all of this again. But does anyone have any questions about any of it? We can go back. I know if you guys have to go too, feel free to leave. But if anyone wants to stay and ask me anything, I don't know. Feel free.
Oh, it was fantastic. That's all I can say. Mind-boggling.
Alright, thank you so much.
It was really very interesting.
Oh, sorry, I can't hear you. Can you?
I think are you able to hear me? Yeah.
Hello?
Are you able to hear me?
Yeah, I can hear you.
Yeah. What I was telling was, a whole lot of things, very frankly, especially in India, in particular considering kind of music which is totally different from the Western music. This was really an eye-opener, I would say.
Yeah, well, thank you. I'm glad you enjoyed.
Yeah. So definitely I'll go through the various sites which we have said. To classical to romantic in the 20th century. I think definitely we must have another session and tell definitely another about it. It should definitely meet again. With this. Yeah. Thank you.
Amazing essay. We thoroughly enjoyed it, and it was nice when you played some complex pieces and said simple, huh? So it was very beautiful. Thoroughly enjoyed it. And learned a lot.
Yeah.
Yeah, I thought it was a great presentation. I was particularly interested in how you talked about the kind of cultural and social and technological evolution of music through the ages, and Beethoven, for example, pushing the boundaries, taking us from one period to the next. I wonder what type of innovators and boundary pushers there were, perhaps, that we don't have a historical record of, during even the Baroque or classical period, but maybe because their ideas were out there, they were lost the time.
Right, and one of the cool things about that is that stuff like that still shows up. Like, that's what I was watching this with my parents, so they probably have already heard this, right? But we were watching like a documentary on like Vivaldi like a few days ago, right? And Vivaldi is one of the most, like, if you've heard of like the Four Seasons, right? Like one of the most famous symphonic works, and people only discovered Vivaldi's music like 50 or 60 years ago because some guy like found it in a church and like brought it to a museum and said, hey, like we found all this stuff in our church basement, and it was like tons of Vivaldi's music, and he's a Baroque composer. That was in one of the earlier sides as well, but not super prominent. And I guess one of the great things about all these being movements is we can still feel like those general trends, even if some people are lost, and sometimes the composers still show up, right? Or sometimes the composer's works are still like found, like even like today. So yeah, but definitely, I'm sure there's many like excellent composers whose music has been lost to the world.
Yeah, that's very cool. Thank you for the presentation. It was fantastically done.
Thanks. Yeah, it was really cool for me. I think what really struck me was how passionate you are about the topic you're presenting and about Beethoven and about the music, and you can tell from just how you talk about it that this is something you really enjoy, and you are able to effortlessly like communicate some very complex concepts, I thought.